Chapter 5. Denham had no conscious intention of following Catherine, but, seeing her depart, he took his hat and ran rather more quickly down the stairs than he would have done if Catherine had not been in front of him. He overtook a friend of his, by name Harry Sandys, who was going the same way, and they walked together a few paces behind Catherine and Rodney. The night was very still, and on such nights, when the traffic thins away, the walker becomes conscious of the moon in the street, as if the curtains of the sky had been drawn apart, and the heaven lay bare, as it does in the country. The air was softly cool, so that people who had been sitting talking in a crowd found it pleasant to walk a little before deciding to stop an omnibus or encounter light again in an underground railway. Sandys, who was a barrister with a philosophic tendency, took out his pipe, lit it, murmured, hum, and ha, and was silent. The couple in front of them kept their distance accurately, and appeared, so far as Denham could judge by the way they turned towards each other, to be talking very constantly. He observed that when a pedestrian going the opposite way forced them to part, they came together again directly afterwards. Without intending to watch them, he never quite lost sight of the yellow scarf twisted round Catherine's head, or the light overcoat which made Rodney look fashionable among the crowd. At the Strand he supposed that they would separate, but instead they crossed the road, and took their way down one of the narrow passages which lead through ancient courts to the river. Among the crowd of people in the big thoroughfares Rodney seemed merely to be lending Catherine his escort. But now, when passengers were rare and the footsteps of the couple were distinctly heard in the silence, Denham could not help picturing to himself some change in their conversation. The effect of the light and shadow, which seemed to increase their height, was to make them mysterious and significant. So that Denham had no feeling of irritation with Catherine, but rather a half-dreamy acquiescence in the course of the world. Yes, she did very well to dream about, but Sandys had suddenly begun to talk. He was a solitary man who had made his friends at college and always addressed them as if they were still undergraduates arguing in his room, though many months or even years had passed in some cases between the last sentence and the present one. The method was a little singular, but very restful, for it seemed to ignore completely all accidents of human life, and to span very deep abysses with a few simple words. On this occasion he began, while they waited for a minute on the edge of the Strand. "I hear that Bennett has given up his theory of truth." Denham returned a suitable answer, and he proceeded to explain how this decision had been arrived at, and what changes it involved in the philosophy which they both accepted. Meanwhile Catherine and Rodney drew further ahead, and Denham kept, if that is the right expression for an involuntary action, one filament of his mind upon them, while with the rest of his intelligence he sought to understand what Sandys was saying. As they passed through the courts thus talking, Sandys laid the tip of his stick upon one of the stones forming a time-worn arch, and struck it meditatively 2 or 3 times in order to illustrate something very obscure about the complex nature of one's apprehension of facts. During the pause which this necessitated, Catherine and Rodney turned the corner and disappeared. For a moment Denham stopped involuntarily in his sentence, and continued it with a sense of having lost something. Unconscious that they were observed, Catherine and Rodney had come out on the embankment. When they had crossed the road, Rodney slapped his hand upon the stone parapet above the river and exclaimed, "I promise I won't say another word about it, Catherine. But do stop a minute and look at the moon upon the water." Catherine paused, looked up and down the river, and snuffed the air. "I'm sure one can smell the sea, with the wind blowing this way," she said. They stood silent for a few moments while the river shifted in its bed, and the silver and red lights which were laid upon it were torn by the current and joined together again. Very far off up the river a steamer hooted with its hollow voice of unspeakable melancholy, as if from the heart of lonely mist-shrouded voyagings. "Ah, Rodney cried, striking his hand once more upon the balustrade. Why can't one say how beautiful it all is? Why am I condemned forever, Catherine, to feel what I can't express? And the things I can give, there's no use in my giving. Trust me, Catherine, he added hastily, I won't speak of it again. But in the presence of beauty, look at the iridescence round the moon. One feels perhaps if you married me. I am half a poet, you see, and I can't pretend not to feel what I do feel. If I could write that would be another matter. I shouldn't bother you to marry me then, Catherine. He spoke these disconnected sentences rather abruptly, with his eyes alternately upon the moon and upon the stream. But for me, I suppose you would recommend marriage? Said Catherine, with her eyes fixed on the moon. Certainly I should. Not for you only, but for all women. Why, you're nothing at all without it, you're only half alive, using only half your faculties, you must feel that for yourself. That is why here he stopped himself, and they began to walk slowly along the embankment, the moon fronting them. With how sad steps she climbs the sky, how silently and with how wan a face. Rodney quote addition. I've been told a great many unpleasant things about myself tonight, Catherine stated, without attending to him. Mr. Denham seems to think it his mission to lecture me, though I hardly know him. By the way, William, you know him, tell me, what is he like? William drew a deep sigh. We may lecture you till we're blue in the face. Yes, but what's he like? And we write sonnets to your eyebrows, you cruel practical creature. Denham? He added, as Catherine remained silent. A good fellow, I should think. He cares, naturally, for the right sort of things, I expect. But you mustn't marry him, though. He scolded you, did he? What did he say? What happens with Mr. Denham is this, he comes to tea. I do all I can to put him at his ease. He merely sits and scowls at me. Then I show him our manuscripts. At this he becomes really angry, and tells me I've no business to call myself a middle-class woman. So we part in a huff, and next time we meet, which was tonight, he walks straight up to me, and says, go to the devil. That's the sort of behavior my mother complains of. I want to know, what does it mean? She paused and, slackening her steps, looked at the lighted train drawing itself smoothly over Hungerford Bridge. It means, I should say, that he finds you chilly and unsympathetic. Catherine laughed with round, separate notes of genuine amusement. It's time I jumped into a cab and hid myself in my own house, she exclaimed. Addition. Would your mother object to my being seen with you? No one could possibly recognize us, could they? Rodney inquired, with some solicitude. Catherine looked at him, and perceiving that his solicitude was genuine, she laughed again, but with an ironical note in her laughter. You may laugh, Catherine, but I can tell you that if any of your friends saw us together at this time of night they would talk about it, and I should find that very disagreeable. But why do you laugh? I don't know. Because you're such a queer mixture, I think. You're half poet and half old maid. I know I always seem to you highly ridiculous. But I can't help having inherited certain traditions and trying to put them into practice. Nonsense, William. You may come of the oldest family in Devonshire, but that's no reason why you should mind being seen alone with me on the embankment. I'm 10 years older than you are, Catherine, and I know more of the world than you do. Very well. Leave me and go home. Rodney looked back over his shoulder and perceived that they were being followed at a short distance by a taxicab, which evidently awaited his summons. Catherine saw it, too, and exclaimed, Don't call that cab for me, William. I shall walk. Nonsense, Catherine, you'll do nothing of the kind. It's nearly 12 o'clock, and we've walked too far as it is." Catherine laughed and walked on so quickly that both Rodney and the taxicab had to increase their pace to keep up with her. "Now, William," she said, "if people see me racing along the embankment like this they will talk. You had far better say good night, if you don't want people to talk." At this William beckoned, with a despotic gesture, to the cab with one hand, and with the other he brought Catherine to a standstill. "Don't let the man see us struggling, for God's sake," he murmured. Catherine stood for a moment quite still. "There's more of the old maid in you than the poet," she observed briefly. William shut the door sharply, gave the address to the driver, and turned away, lifting his hat punctiliously high in farewell to the invisible lady. He looked back after the cab twice, suspiciously, half expecting that she would stop it and dismount, but it bore her swiftly on, and was soon out of sight. William felt in the mood for a short soliloquy of indignation, for Catherine had contrived to exasperate him in more ways than one. "Of all the unreasonable, inconsiderate creatures I've ever known, she's the worst," he exclaimed to himself, striding back along the embankment. "Heaven forbid that I should ever make a fool of myself with her again. Why, I'd sooner marry the daughter of my landlady than Catherine Hilbery. She'd leave me not a moment's peace, and she'd never understand me, never, never, never." Uttered aloud and with vehemence so that the stars of heaven might hear, for there was no human being at hand, these sentiments sounded satisfactorily irrefutable. Rodney quieted down, and walked on in silence, until he perceived someone approaching him, who had something, either in his walk or his dress, which proclaimed that he was one of William's acquaintances before it was possible to tell which of them he was. It was Denham who, having parted from Sandys at the bottom of his staircase, was now walking to the tube at Charing Cross. Deep in the thoughts which his talk with Sandys had suggested, he had forgotten the meeting at Mary Datchet's rooms. He had forgotten Rodney, and metaphors and Elizabethan drama, and could have sworn that he had forgotten Catherine Hilbery, too, although that was more disputable. His mind was scaling the highest pinnacles of its Alps, where there was only starlight and the untrodden snow. Ha! If he had been in full possession of his mind, Denham would probably have passed on with a salutation. But the shock of the interruption made him stand still, and before he knew what he was doing, he had turned and was walking with Rodney in obedience to Rodney's invitation to come to his rooms and have something to drink. Denham had no wish to drink with Rodney, but he followed him passively enough. Rodney was gratified by this obedience. He felt inclined to be communicative with this silent man, who possessed so obviously all the good masculine qualities in which Catherine now seemed lamentably deficient. "You do well, Denham," he began impulsively, "to have nothing to do with young women. I offer you my experience. If one trusts them, one invariably has cause to repent. Not that I have any reason at this moment," he added hastily, "to complain of them. It's a subject that crops up now and again for no particular reason. Miss Datchet, I dare say, is one of the exceptions. Do you like Miss Datchet?" These remarks indicated clearly enough that Rodney's nerves were in a state of irritation, and Denham speedily woke to the situation of the world as it had been 1 hour ago. He had last seen Rodney walking with Catherine. He could not help regretting the eagerness with which his mind returned to these interests, and fretted him with the old trivial anxieties. He sank in his own esteem. Reason bade him break from Rodney, who clearly tended to become confidential, before he had utterly lost touch with the problems of high philosophy. He looked along the road, and marked a lamp-post at a distance of some 100 yards, and decided that he would part from Rodney when they reached this point. "Yes, I like Mary. I don't see how one could help liking her," he remarked cautiously, with his eye on the lamp-post. "Ah, Denham, you're so different from me. You never give yourself away. I watched you this evening with Catherine Hilbery. My instinct is to trust the person I'm talking to. That's why I'm always being taken in, I suppose." Denham seemed to be pondering this statement of Rodney's, but, as a matter of fact, he was hardly conscious of Rodney and his revelations, and was only concerned to make him mention Catherine again before they reached the Lampe Saint. "Who's taken you in now?" he asked. "Addition, Catherine Hilbery?" Rodney stopped and once more began beating a kind of rhythm, as if he were marking a phrase in a symphony, upon the smooth stone balustrade of the embankment. "Catherine Hilbery," he repeated, with a curious little chuckle. "No, Denham, I have no illusions about that young woman. I think I made that plain to her tonight. But don't run away with a false impression," he continued eagerly, turning and linking his arm through Denham's, as though to prevent him from escaping, and, thus compelled, Denham passed the monitory lamppost, to which, in passing, he breathed an excuse, for how could he break away when Rodney's arm was actually linked in his? "You must not think that I have any bitterness against her, far from it. It's not altogether her fault, poor girl. She lives, you know, one of those odious, self-centered lives. At least, I think them odious for a woman feeding her wits upon everything, having control of everything, getting far too much her own way at home, spoiled, in a sense, feeling that everyone is at her feet, and so not realizing how she hurts, that is, how rudely she behaves to people who haven't all her advantages. Still, to do her justice, she's no fool," he added, as if to warn Denham not to take any liberties. "She has sweet, she has sense. She can understand you when you talk to her." "And did you tell her all this tonight?" Denham asked. "Addition, oh dear me, no. I should never think of telling Catherine the truth about herself. That wouldn't do at all. One has to be in an attitude of adoration in order to get on with Catherine. Now I've learnt that she's refused to marry him, why don't I go home?" Denham thought to himself. But he went on walking beside Rodney, and for a time they did not speak, though Rodney hummed snatches of a tune out of an opera by Mozart. A feeling of contempt and liking combined very naturally in the mind of one to whom another has just spoken unpremeditatedly, revealing rather more of his private feelings than he intended to reveal. Denham began to wonder what sort of person Rodney was, and at the same time Rodney began to think about Denham. "You're a slave like me, I suppose?" he asked. "Addition, a solicitor, yes. I sometimes wonder why we don't chuck it. Why don't you emigrate, Denham? I should have thought that would suit you. I've a family. I'm often on the point of going myself. And then I know I couldn't live without this," and he waved his hand towards the city of London, which wore, at this moment, the appearance of a town cut out of grey-blue cardboard, and pasted flat against the sky, which was of a deeper blue. "There are one or two people I'm fond of, and there's a little good music, and a few pictures, now and then, just enough to keep one dangling about here. Ah, but I couldn't live with savages." "Are you fond of books? Music? Pictures? D'you care at all for first editions? I've got a few nice things up here, things I pick up cheap, for I can't afford to give what they ask." They had reached a small court of high 18th century houses, in one of which Rodney had his room. As they climbed a very steep staircase, through whose uncurtained windows the moonlight fell, illuminating the banisters with their twisted pillars, and the piles of plates set on the windowsills, and jars half full of milk. Rodney's rooms were small, but the sitting-room window looked out into a courtyard, with its flagged pavement, and its single tree, and across to the flat red brick fronts of the opposite houses, which would not have surprised Dr. Johnson if he had come out of his grave for a turn in the moonlight. Rodney lit his lamp, pulled his curtains, offered Denham a chair, and, flinging the manuscript of his paper on the Elizabethan use of metaphor onto the table. Exclaimed, "Oh dear me, what a waste of time. But it's over now, and so we may think no more about it." He then busied himself very dexterously in lighting a fire, producing glasses, whiskey, a cake, and cups and saucers. He put on a faded crimson dressing gown, and a pair of red slippers, and advanced to Denham with a tumbler in one hand and a well-burnished book in the other. "The Baskerville Congreve," said Rodney, offering it to his goo established. "I couldn't read him in a cheap edition." When he was seen thus among his books and his valuables, amiably anxious to make his visitor comfortable, and moving about with something of the dexterity and grace of a Persian cat, Denham relaxed his critical attitude, and felt more at home with Rodney than he would have done with many men better known to him. Rodney's room was the room of a person who cherishes a great many personal tastes, guarding them from the rough blasts of the public with scrupulous attention. His papers and his books rose in jagged mounds on table and floor, round which he skirted with nervous care lest his dressing-gown might disarrange them ever so slightly. On a chair stood a stack of photographs of statues and pictures, which it was his habit to exhibit, one by one, for the space of a day or two. The books on his shelves were as orderly as regiments of soldiers, and the backs of them shone like so many bronze beetle wings. Though, if you took one from its place you saw a shabbier volume behind it, since space was limited. Edition an oval Venetian mirror stood above the fireplace, and reflected duskily in its spotted depths the faint yellow and crimson of a jarful of tulips which stood among the letters and pipes and cigarettes upon the mantelpiece. A small piano occupied a corner of the room, with the score of Don Giovanni open upon the bracket. "Well, Rodney," said Denham, as he filled his pipe and looked about him, "this is all very nice and comfortable." Rodney turned his head half round and smiled, with the pride of a proprietor, and then prevented himself from smiling. "Tolerable," he muttered. "Addition, but I dare say it's just as well that you have to earn your own living. If you mean that I shouldn't do anything good with leisure if I had it, I dare say you're right." "I doubt that," Denham replied. Addition. They sat silent, and the smoke from their pipes joined amicably in a blue vapor above their heads. "I could spend 3 hours every day reading Shakespeare," Rodney remarked. Addition, "and there's music and pictures, let alone the society of the people one likes. You'd be bored to death in a year's time." "Oh, I grant you I should be bored if I did nothing. But I should write plays." "Hem. I should write plays," he repeated. Addition, "I've written 3/4 of one already, and I'm only waiting for a holiday to finish it. And it's not bad, no, some of it's really rather nice." The question arose in Denham's mind whether he should ask to see this play, as, no doubt, he was expected to do. He looked rather stealthily at Rodney, who was tapping the coal nervously with a poker, and quivering almost physically. So Denham thought, with desire to talk about this play of his, and vanity unrequited and urgent. He seemed very much at Denham's mercy, and Denham could not help liking him, partly on that account. "Well, will you let me see the play?" Denham asked, and Rodney looked immediately appeased, but, nevertheless, he sat silent for a moment, holding the poker perfectly upright in the air, regarding it with his rather prominent eyes, and opening his lips and shutting them again. "Do you really care for this kind of thing?" he asked at length, in a different tone of voice from that in which he had been speaking. And, without waiting for an answer, he went on, rather querulously, "Very few people care for poetry. I dare say it bores you." "Perhaps," Denham remarked. Addition, "Well, I'll lend it you," Rodney announced, putting down the poker. As he moved to fetch the play, Denham stretched a hand to the bookcase beside him, and took down the first volume which his fingers touched. Addition. It happened to be a small and very lovely edition of Sir Thomas Browne, containing the Urn Burial, the Hydriotaphia, and the Garden of Cyrus, and, opening it at a passage which he knew very nearly by heart, Denham began to read and, for some time, continued to read. Rodney resumed his seat, with his manuscript on his knee, and from time to time he glanced at Denham, and then joined his fingertips and crossed his thin legs over the fender, as if he experienced a good deal of pleasure. At length Denham shut the book and stood, with his back to the fireplace, occasionally making an inarticulate humming sound which seemed to refer to Sir Thomas Browne. He put his hat on his head and stood over Rodney, who still lay stretched back in his chair, with his toes within the fender. "I shall look in again some time," Denham remarked, upon which Rodney held up his hand, containing his manuscript, without saying anything except "dash, if you like." Denham took the manuscript and went. 2 days later he was much surprised to find a thin parcel on his breakfast plate, which, on being opened, revealed the very copy of Sir Thomas Browne which he had studied so intently in Rodney's rooms. From sheer laziness he returned no thanks, but he thought of Rodney from time to time with interest, disconnecting him from Catherine, and meant to go round one evening and smoke a pipe with him. Chapter 6. Of all the hours of an ordinary working weekday, which are the pleasantest to look forward to and to look back upon? If a single instance is of use in framing a theory, it may be said that the minutes between 9:25 and 9:30 in the morning had a singular charm for Mary Datchet. She spent them in a very enviable frame of mind. Her contentment was almost unalloyed, high in the air as her flat was. Some beams from the morning sun reached her even in November, striking straight at curtain, chair, and carpet, and painting their 3 bright, true spaces of green, blue, and purple, upon which the eye rested with a pleasure which gave physical warmth to the body. There were few mornings when Mary did not look up, as she bent to lace her boots, and as she followed the yellow rod from curtain to breakfast table she usually breathed some sigh of thankfulness that her life provided her with such moments of pure enjoyment. She was robbing no one of anything, and yet, to get so much pleasure from simple things, such as eating one's breakfast alone in a room which had nice colors in it, clean from the skirting of the boards to the corners of the ceiling, seemed to suit her so thoroughly that she used at first to hunt about for someone to apologize to, or for some flaw in the situation. She had now been 6 months in London, and she could find no flaw, but that, as she invariably concluded by the time her boots were laced, was solely and entirely due to the fact that she had her work. Every day, as she stood with her dispatch box in her hand at the door of her flat, and gave one look back into the room to see that everything was straight before she left, she said to herself that she was very glad that she was going to leave it all, that to have sat there all day long, in the enjoyment of leisure, would have been intolerable. Out in the street she liked to think herself one of the workers who, at this hour, take their way in rapid single file along all the broad pavements of the city, with their heads slightly lowered, as if all their effort were to follow each other as closely as might be. So that Mary used to figure to herself a straight rabbit run worn by their unswerving feet upon the pavement. But she liked to pretend that she was indistinguishable from the rest, and that when a wet day drove her to the Underground or omnibus, she gave and took her share of crowd and wet with clerks and typists and commercial men, and shared with them the serious business of winding up the world to tick for another 24 hours. Thus thinking, on the particular morning in question, she made her way across Lincoln's Inn Fields and up Kingsway, and so through Southampton Row until she reached her office in Russell Square. Now and then she would pause and look into the window of some bookseller or flower shop, where, at this early hour, the goods were being arranged, and empty gaps behind the plate glass revealed a state of undress. Mary felt kindly disposed towards the shopkeepers, and hoped that they would trick the midday public into purchasing. For at this hour of the morning she ranged herself entirely on the side of the shopkeepers and bank clerks, and regarded all who slept late and had money to spend as her enemy and natural prey. And directly she had crossed the road at Holborn, her thoughts all came naturally and regularly to roost upon her work. And she forgot that she was, properly speaking, an amateur worker, whose services were unpaid, and could hardly be said to wind the world up for its daily task. Since the world, so far, had shown very little desire to take the boons which Mary's Society for Woman's Suffrage had offered it. She was thinking all the way up Southampton Row of notepaper and foolscap, and how an economy in the use of paper might be effected, without, of course, hurting Mrs. Seal's feelings, for she was certain that the great organizers always pounce, to begin with, upon trifles like these, and build up their triumphant reforms upon a basis of absolute solidity. And, without acknowledging it for a moment, Mary Datchet was determined to be a great organizer, and had already doomed her society to reconstruction of the most radical kind. Once or twice lately, it is true, she had started, broad awake, before turning into Russell Square, and denounced herself rather sharply for being already in a groove. Capable, that is, of thinking the same thoughts every morning at the same hour. So that the chestnut-colored brick of the Russell Square houses had some curious connection with her thoughts about office economy, and served also as a sign that she should get into trim for meeting Mr. Clacton, or Mrs. Seal, or whoever might be beforehand with her at the office. Having no religious belief, she was the more conscientious about her life, examining her position from time to time very seriously. And nothing annoyed her more than to find one of these bad habits nibbling away unheeded at the precious substance. What was the good, after all, of being a woman if one didn't keep fresh, and cram one's life with all sorts of views and experiments? Thus she always gave herself a little shake, as she turned the corner, and, as often as not, reached her own door whistling a snatch of a Somersetshire ballad. The suffrage office was at the top of one of the large Russell Square houses, which had once been lived in by a great city merchant and his family, and was now let out in slices to a number of societies which displayed assorted initials upon doors of ground glass, and kept, each of them, a typewriter which clicked busily all day long. The old house, with its great stone staircase, echoed hollowly to the sound of typewriters and of errand boys from 10 to 6. She sat herself down to her letters, and very soon all these speculations were forgotten, and the two lines drew themselves between her eyebrows, as the contents of the letters, the office furniture, and the sounds of activity in the next room gradually asserted their sway upon her. By 11 o'clock the atmosphere of concentration was running so strongly in one direction that any thought of a different order could hardly have survived its birth more than a moment or so. The task which lay before her was to organize a series of entertainments, the profits of which were to benefit the society, which drooped for want of funds. It was her first attempt at organization on a large scale, and she meant to achieve something remarkable. She meant to use the cumbrous machine to pick out this, that, and the other interesting person from the muddle of the world, and to set them for a week in a pattern which must catch the eyes of cabinet ministers, and the eyes once caught. The old arguments were to be delivered with unexampled originality. Such was the scheme as a whole, and in contemplation of it she would become quite flushed and excited, and have to remind herself of all the details that intervened between her and success. The door would open, and Mr. Clacton would come in to search for a certain leaflet buried beneath a pyramid of leaflets. He was a thin, sandy-haired man of about 35, spoke with a Cockney accent, and had about him a frugal look, as if nature had not dealt generously with him in any way, which, naturally, prevented him from dealing generously with other people. When he had found his leaflet, and offered a few jocular hints upon keeping papers in order, the typewriting would stop abruptly, and Mrs. Seal would burst into the room with a letter which needed explanation in her hand. This was a more serious interruption than the other, because she never knew exactly what she wanted, and half a dozen requests would bolt from her. No one of which was clearly stat edition dressed in plum-colored velveteen, with short, gray hair, and a face that seemed permanently flushed with philanthropic enthusiasm. She was always in a hurry, and always in some disorder. She wore 2 crucifixes, which got themselves entangled in a heavy gold chain upon her breast, and seemed to Mary expressive of her mental ambiguity. Only her vast enthusiasm and her worship of Miss Markham, one of the pioneers of the society, kept her in her place, for which she had no sound qualification. So the morning wore on, and the pile of letters grew, and Mary felt, at last, that she was the center ganglion of a very fine network of nerves which fell over England. And one of these days, when she touched the heart of the system, would begin feeling and rushing together and emitting their splendid blaze of revolutionary fireworks, for some such metaphor represents what she felt about her work. When her brain had been heated by 3 hours of application. Shortly before 1 o'clock Mr. Clacton and Mrs. Seal desisted from their labors, and the old joke about luncheon, which came out regularly at this hour, was repeated with scarcely any variation of words. Mr. Clacton patronized a vegetarian restaurant. Mrs. Seal brought sandwiches, which she ate beneath the plane trees in Russell Square, while Mary generally went to a gaudy establishment, upholstered in red plush, nearby, where, much to the vegetarian's disapproval, you could buy steak, 2 inches thick, or a roast section of fowl, swimming in a pewter dish. The bare branches against the sky do one so much good, Mrs. Seal asserted, looking out into the square. But one can't lunch off trees, Sally, said Mary. I confess I don't know how you manage it, Miss Datchet, Mr. Clacton remarked. I should sleep all the afternoon, I know, if I took a heavy meal in the middle of the day. What's the very latest thing in literature? So they parted and Mary walked away, wondering if they guessed that she really wanted to get away from them, and supposing that they had not quite reached that degree of subtlety. She bought herself an evening paper, which she read as she ate, looking over the top of it again and again at the queer people who were buying cakes or imparting their secrets. Until some young woman whom she knew came in, and she called out, "Eleanor, come and sit by me," and they finished their lunch together, parting on the strip of pavement among the different lines of traffic with a pleasant feeling that they were stepping once more into their separate places in the great and eternally moving pattern of human life. But, instead of going straight back to the office today, Mary turned into the British Museum and strolled down the gallery with the shapes of stone until she found an empty seat directly beneath the gaze of the Elgin marbles. She looked at them and seemed, as usual, borne up on some wave of exaltation and emotion, by which her life at once became solemn and beautiful, an impression which was due as much, perhaps, to the solitude and chill and silence of the gallery as to the actual beauty of the statues. One must suppose, at least, that her emotions were not purely aesthetic, because, after she had gazed at the Ulysses for a minute or two, she began to think about Ralph Denham. So secure did she feel with these silent shapes that she almost yielded to an impulse to say, "I am in love with you," aloud. The presence of this immense and enduring beauty made her almost alarmingly conscious of her desire, and at the same time proud of a feeling which did not display anything like the same proportions when she was going about her daily work. She repressed her impulse to speak aloud, and rose and wandered about rather aimlessly among the statues until she found herself in another gallery devoted to engraved obelisks and winged Assyrian bulls. And her emotion took another turn. She began to picture herself traveling with Ralph in a land where these monsters were captioned in the sand. For, she thought to herself, as she gazed fixedly at some information printed behind a piece of glass, "The wonderful thing about you is that you're ready for anything, you're not in the least conventional. Like most clever men. And she conjured up a scene of herself on a camel's back, in the desert, while Ralph commanded a whole tribe of natives. That is what you can do, she went on, moving on to the next statue. You always make people do what you want. A glow spread over her spirit, and filled her eyes with brightness. Nevertheless, before she left the museum she was very far from saying, even in the privacy of her own mind, I am in love with you, and that sentence might very well never have framed itself. She was, indeed, rather annoyed with herself for having allowed such an ill-considered breach of her reserve, weakening her powers of resistance, she felt, should this impulse return again. For, as she walked along the street to her office, the force of all her customary objections to being in love with anyone overcame her. She did not want to marry at all. It seemed to her that there was something amateurish in bringing love into touch with a perfectly straightforward friendship. Such as hers was with Ralph, which, for 2 years now, had based itself upon common interests in impersonal topics, such as the housing of the poor, or the taxation of land values. But the afternoon spirit differed intrinsically from the morning spirit. Mary found herself watching the flight of a bird, or making drawings of the branches of the plane trees upon her blotting paper. People came in to see Mr. Clacton on business, and a seductive smell of cigarette smoke issued from his room. Mrs. Seal wandered about with newspaper cuttings, which seemed to her either quite splendid or really too bad for words. She used to paste these into books, or send them to her friends, having first drawn a broad bar in blue pencil down the margin. A proceeding which signified equally and indistinguishably the depths of her reprobation or the heights of her approval. About 4 o'clock on that same afternoon Catherine Hilbery was walking up Kingsway. The question of tea presented itself. The street lamps were being lit already, and as she stood still for a moment beneath one of them, she tried to think of some neighboring drawing-room where there would be firelight and talk congenial to her mood. That mood, owing to the spinning traffic and the evening veil of unreality, was ill-adapted to her home surroundings. Perhaps, on the whole, a shop was the best place in which to preserve this queer sense of heightened existence. At the same time she wished to talk. Remembering Mary Datchet and her repeated invitations, she crossed the road, turned into Russell Square, and peered about, seeking for numbers with a sense of adventure that was out of all proportion to the deed itself. She found herself in a dimly lighted hall, unguarded by a porter, and pushed open the first swing door. But the office boy had never heard of Miss Datchet. Did she belong to the SRFR? Catherine shook her head with a smile of dismay. A voice from within shouted, "Number the SGS top floor." Catherine mounted past innumerable glass doors, with initials on them, and became steadily more and more doubtful of the wisdom of her venture. At the top she paused for a moment to breathe and collect herself. She heard the typewriter and formal professional voices inside, not belonging, she thought, to anyone she had ever spoken to. She touched the bell, and the door was opened almost immediately by Mary herself. Her face had to change its expression entirely when she saw Catherine. "You!" she exclaimed. "Addition, we thought you were the printer." Still holding the door open, she called back, "No, Mr. Clacton, it's not Pennington's. I should ring them up again 3388, Central." "Well, this is a surprise. Come in," she added. "Addition, you're just in time for tea." The light of relief shone in Mary's eyes. The boredom of the afternoon was dissipated at once, and she was glad that Catherine had found them in a momentary press of activity, owing to the failure of the printer to send back certain proofs. The unshaded electric light shining upon the table covered with papers dazed Catherine for a moment. After the confusion of her twilight walk, and her random thoughts, life in this small room appeared extremely concentrated and bright. She turned instinctively to look out of the window, which was uncurtained, but Mary immediately recalled her. "It was very clever of you to find your way," she said, and Catherine wondered, as she stood there, feeling, for the moment, entirely detached and unabsorbed, why she had come. She looked, indeed, to Mary's eyes strangely out of place in the office. Her figure in the long cloak, which took deep folds, and her face, which was composed into a mask of sensitive apprehension, disturbed Mary for a moment with a sense of the presence of someone who was of another world, and, therefore, subversive of her world. She became immediately anxious that Catherine should be impressed by the importance of her world, and hoped that neither Mrs. Seal nor Mr. Clacton would appear until the impression of importance had been received. But in this she was disappointed. Mrs. Seal burst into the room holding a kettle in her hand, which she set upon the stove, and then, with inefficient haste, she set light to the gas, which flared up, exploded, and went out. Always the way, she muttered. Kit Markham is the only person who knows how to deal with the thing. Mary had to go to her help, and together they spread the table, and apologized for the disparity between the cups and the plainness of the food. "If we had known Miss Hilbery was coming, we should have bought a cake," said Mary, upon which Mrs. Seal looked at Catherine for the first time suspiciously, because she was a person who needed cake. Here Mr. Clacton opened the door, and came in, holding a typewritten letter in his hand, which he was reading aloud. "Salford's affiliated," he said. "Well done, Salford," Mrs. Seal exclaimed enthusiastically, thumping the teapot which she held upon the table, in token of applause. "Yes, these provincial centres seem to be coming into line at last," said Mr. Clacton, and then Mary introduced him to Miss Hilbery. And he asked her, in a very formal manner, if she were interested in our work. "And the proofs still not come?" said Mrs. Seal, putting both her elbows on the table and propping her chin on her hands, as Mary began to pour out tea. "It's too bad, too bad. At this rate we shall miss the country passant. Which reminds me, Mr. Clacton, don't you think we should circularize the provinces with Partridge's last speech?" "What? You've not read it?" "Oh, it's the best thing they've had in the House this session." But Mary cut her short. "We don't allow shop at tea, Sally," she said firmly. "We fine her a penny each time she forgets, and the fines go to buying a plum cake," she explained, seeking to draw Catherine into the community. She had given up all hope of impressing her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Seal apologized. It's my misfortune to be an enthusiast," she said, turning to Catherine. "My father's daughter could hardly be anything else. I think I've been on as many committees as most people. Waifs and strays, rescue work, church work, C.O.S. local branch, besides the usual civic duties which fall to one as a householder." "It'll be sixpence, at least, Sally," said Mary, bringing her fist down on the table. "And we're all sick to death of women and their votes." Mrs. Seal looked for a moment as though she could hardly believe her ears, and made a deprecating "Tut tut tut" in her throat, looking alternately at Catherine and Mary, and shaking her head as she did so. Then she remarked, rather confidentially to Catherine, with a little nod in Mary's direction, "She's doing more for the cause than any of us. She's giving her youth for, alas. When I was young there were domestic circumstances she sighed, and stopped short. Mr. Clacton hastily reverted to the joke about luncheon, and explained how Mrs. Seal fed on a bag of biscuits under the trees. Whatever the weather might be, rather, Catherine thought, as though Mrs. Seal were a pet dog who had convenient tricks. "Yes, I took my little bag into the square," said Mrs. Seal, with the self-conscious guilt of a child owning some fault to its elders. "It was really very sustaining, and the bare boughs against the sky do one so much good." But I shall have to give up going into the square, she proceeded, wrinkling her forehead. The injustice of it. Why should I have a beautiful square all to myself, when poor women who need rest have nowhere at all to sit? She looked fiercely at Catherine, giving her short locks a little shake. It's dreadful what a tyrant one still is, in spite of all one's efforts. One tries to lead a decent life, but one can't. Of course, directly one thinks of it, one sees that all squares should be open to every one. Is there any society with that object, Mr. Clacton? If not, there should be, surely. A most excellent object, said Mr. Clacton in his professional manner. At the same time, one must deplore the ramification of organizations, Mrs. Seal. So much excellent effort thrown away, not to speak of pounds, shillings, and pence. Now how many organizations of a philanthropic nature do you suppose there are in the City of London itself, Miss Hilbery? He added, screwing his mouth into a queer little smile, as if to show that the question had its frivolous side. Catherine smiled, too. Her unlikeness to the rest of them had, by this time, penetrated to Mr. Clacton, who was not naturally observant. And he was wondering who she was. This same unlikeness had subtly stimulated Mrs. Seal to try and make a convert of her. Mary, too, looked at her almost as if she begged her to make things easy. For Catherine had shown no disposition to make things easy. She had scarcely spoken, and her silence, though grave and even thoughtful, seemed to Mary the silence of one who criticizes. Well, there are more in this house than I'd any notion of, she said. Why do you say that we do these things? Mary interposed, rather sharply. We're not responsible for all the cranks who choose to lodge in the same house with us. Mr. Clacton cleared his throat and looked at each of the young ladies in turn. He was a good deal struck by the appearance and manner of Miss Hilbery, which seemed to him to place her among those cultivated and luxurious people of whom he used to dream. Mary, on the other hand, was more of his own sort, and a little too much inclined to order him about. He picked up crumbs of dry biscuit and put them into his mouth with incredible rapidity. You don't belong to our society, then? Said Mrs. Seal. No, I'm afraid I don't, said Catherine, with such ready candor that Mrs. Seal was nonplussed, and stared at her with a puzzled expression. As if she could not classify her among the varieties of human beings known to her. But surely, she began. Mrs. Seal is an enthusiast in these matters, said Mr. Clacton, almost apologetically. We have to remind her sometimes that others have a right to their views even if they differ from our own. Punch has a very funny picture this week about a suffragist and an agricultural laborer. Have you seen this week's Punch, Miss Datchet? Mary laughed and said, "Number." Mr. Clacton then told them the substance of the joke, which, however, depended a good deal for its success upon the expression which the artist had put into the people's faces. Mrs. Seal sat all the time perfectly Gr Avenue. Directly he had done speaking she burst out. But surely, if you care about the welfare of your sex at all, you must wish them to have the vote. I never said I didn't wish them to have the vote, Catherine protested. Then why aren't you a member of our society? Catherine stirred her spoon round and round, stared into the swirl of the tea, and remained silent. Mr. Clacton, meanwhile, framed a question which, after a moment's hesitation, he put to Catherine. Are you in any way related, I wonder, to the poet Alardus? His daughter, I believe, married a Mr. Hilbery. Yes, I'm the poet's granddaughter, said Catherine, with a little sigh, after a pause, and for a moment they were all silent. The poet's granddaughter. Mrs. Seal repeated, half to herself, with a shake of her head, as if that explained what was otherwise inexplicable. The light kindled in Mr. Clacton's eye. Ah, indigestion that interests me very much, he said. I owe a great debt to your grandfather, Miss Hilbery. At one time I could have repeated the greater part of him by heart. But one gets out of the way of reading poetry, unfortunately. You don't remember him, I suppose? A sharp rap at the door made Catherine's answer inaudible. Mrs. Seal looked up with renewed hope in her eyes, and exclaiming, "The proofs at last!" ran to open the door. "Oh, it's only Mr. Denham," she cried, without any attempt to conceal her disappointment. Ralph, Catherine supposed, was a frequent visitor, for the only person he thought it necessary to greet was herself. And Mary at once explained the strange fact of her being there by saying, "Catherine has come to see how one runs an office." Ralph felt himself stiffen uncomfortably, as he said, "I hope Mary hasn't persuaded you that she knows how to run an office?" "What, doesn't she?" said Catherine, looking from one to the other. At these remarks Mrs. Seal began to exhibit signs of discomposure, which displayed themselves by a tossing movement of her head. And, as Ralph took a letter from his pocket, and placed his finger upon a certain sentence, she forestalled him by exclaiming in confusion, "Now, I know what you're going to say, Mr. Denham. But it was the day Kit Markham was here, and she upsets one so with her wonderful vitality. Always thinking of something new that we ought to be doing and aren't, and I was conscious at the time that my dates were mixedition. It had nothing to do with Mary at all. I assure you." "My dear Sally, don't apologize," said Mary, laughing. "Men are such pedants, they don't know what things matter, and what things don't." "Now, Denham, speak up for our sex," said Mr. Clacton in a jocular manner, indeed, but like most insignificant men he was very quick to resent being found fault with by a woman, in argument with whom he was fond of calling himself a mere man. He wished, however, to enter into a literary conversation with Miss Hilbery, and thus let the matter drop. "Doesn't it seem strange to you, Miss Hilbery," he said, "that the French, with all their wealth of illustrious names, have no poet who can compare with your grandfather? Let me see." Here the telephone bell rang, and he had to absent himself with a smile and a bow which signified that, although literature is delightful, it is not work. Mrs. Seal rose at the same time, but remained hovering over the table, delivering herself of a tirade against party government. "For if I were to tell you what I know of backstairs intrigue, and what can be done by the power of the purse, you wouldn't credit me, Mr. Denham, you wouldn't, indeed, which is why I feel that the only work for my father's daughter, for he was one of the pioneers, Mr. Denham, and on his tombstone I had that verse from the Psalms put, about the Sowers and the S.E. edition. And what wouldn't I give that he should be alive now, seeing what we're going to see dash, but reflecting that the glories of the future depended in part upon the activity of her typewriter." She bobbed her head, and hurried back to the seclusion of her little room, from which immediately issued sounds of enthusiastic, but obviously erratic, composition. Mary made it clear at once, by starting a fresh topic of general interest, that though she saw the humor of her colleague, she did not intend to have her laughed at. "The standard of morality seems to me frightfully low," she observed reflectively, pouring out a second cup of tea. "Especially among women who aren't well educated. They don't see that small things matter, and that's where the leakage begins. And then we find ourselves in difficulties. I very nearly lost my temper yesterday," she went on, looking at Ralph with a little smile, as though he knew what happened when she lost her temper. "It makes me very angry when people tell me lies. Doesn't it make you angry?" she asked Catherine. "But considering that every one tells lies," Catherine remarked, looking about the room to see where she had put down her umbrella and her parcel. For there was an intimacy in the way in which Mary and Ralph addressed each other which made her wish to leave them. Mary, on the other hand, was anxious, superficially at least, that Catherine should stay and so fortify her in her determination not to be in love with Ralph. Ralph, while lifting his cup from his lips to the table, had made up his mind that if Miss Hilbery left, he would go with her. "I don't think that I tell lies, and I don't think that Ralph tells lies, do you, Ralph?" Catherine laughed, with more gaiety, as it seemed to Mary, than she could properly account for. What was she laughing at? At them, presumably. Catherine had risen, and was glancing hither and thither, at the presses and the cupboards, and all the machinery of the office. As if she included them all in her rather malicious amusement, which caused Mary to keep her eyes on her straightly and rather fiercely. As if she were a gay-plumed, mischievous bird, who might light on the topmost bough and pick off the ruddiest cherry. Without any warning. Two women less like each other could scarcely be imagined, Ralph thought, looking from one to the other. Next moment, he too rose, and nodding to Mary, as Catherine said goodbye, opened the door for her, and followed her out. Mary sat still and made no attempt to prevent them from going. For a second or two after the door had shut on them, her eyes rested on the door with a straightforward fierceness in which, for a moment, a certain degree of bewilderment seemed to enter, but, after a brief hesitation, she put down her cup and proceeded to clear away the tea things. The impulse which had driven Ralph to take this action was the result of a very swift little piece of reasoning. And thus, perhaps, was not quite so much of an impulse as it seemed addition it passed through his mind that if he missed this chance of talking to Catherine, he would have to face an enraged ghost, when he was alone in his room again, demanding an explanation of his cowardly indecision. It was better, on the whole, to risk present discomfiture than to waste an evening bandying excuses and constructing impossible scenes with this uncompromising section of himself. For ever since he had visited the Hilberys he had been much at the mercy of a phantom Catherine, who came to him when he sat alone, and answered him as he would have her answer, and was always beside him to crown those varying triumphs which were transacted almost every night, in imaginary scenes, as he walked through the lamplit streets home from the office. To walk with Catherine in the flesh would either feed that phantom with fresh food, which, as all who nourish dreams are aware, is a process that becomes necessary from time to time, or refine it to such a degree of thinness that it was scarcely serviceable any longer. And that, too, is sometimes a welcome change to a dreamer. And all the time Ralph was well aware that the bulk of Catherine was not represented in his dreams at all. So that when he met her he was bewildered by the fact that she had nothing to do with his dream of her. When, on reaching the street, Catherine found that Mr. Denham proceeded to keep pace by her side, she was surprised and, perhaps, a little annoyed. She, too, had her margin of imagination, and tonight her activity in this obscure region of the mind required solitude. If she had her way, she would have walked very fast down the Tottenham Court Road, and then sprung into a cab and raced swiftly home. The view she had of the inside of an office was of the nature of a dream to her. Shut off up there, she compared Mrs. Seal and Mary Datchet and Mr. Clacton to enchanted people in a bewitched tower, with the spider's webs looping across the corners of the room, and all the tools of the necromancer's craft at hand. For so aloof and unreal and apart from the normal world did they seem to her, in the house of innumerable typewriters, murmuring their incantations and concocting their drugs, and flinging their frail spiders' webs over the torrent of life which rushed down the streets outside. She may have been conscious that there was some exaggeration in this fancy of hers, for she certainly did not wish to share it with Ralph. To him, she supposed, Mary Datchet, composing leaflets for cabinet ministers among her typewriters, represented all that was interesting and genuine. And, accordingly, she shut them both out from all share in the crowded street, with its pendant necklace of lamps, its lighted windows, and its throng of men and women, which exhilarated her to such an extent that she very nearly forgot her companion. She walked very fast, and the effect of people passing in the opposite direction was to produce a queer dizziness both in her head and in Ralph's, which set their bodies far apart. But she did her duty by her companion almost unconsciously. Mary Datchet does that sort of work very well. She's responsible for it, I suppose? Yes. The others don't help at all. Has she made a convert of you? Oh no. That is, I'm a convert already. But she hasn't persuaded you to work for them? Oh dear no, that wouldn't do at all. So they walked on down the Tottenham Court Road, parting and coming together again, and Ralph felt much as though he were addressing the summit of a poplar in a high gale of wind. Suppose we get on to that omnibus? Catherine acquiesced, and they climbed up, and found themselves alone on top of it. But which way are you going? Catherine asked, waking a little from the trance into which movement among moving things had thrown her. I'm going to the temple, Ralph replied, inventing a destination on the spur of the moment. He felt the change come over her as they sat down and the omnibus began to move forward. He imagined her contemplating the avenue in front of them with those honest sad eyes which seemed to set him at such a distance from them. But the breeze was blowing in their faces, it lifted her hat for a second, and she drew out a pin and stuck it in again. A little action which seemed, for some reason, to make her rather more fallible. Ah, if only her hat would blow off, and leave her altogether disheveled, accepting it from his hands. This is like Venice, she observed, raising her hand. The motor cars, I mean, shooting about so quickly, with their lights. I've never seen Venice, he replied. Addition, I keep that and some other things for my old age. What are the other things? She asked. Addition, there's Venice and India and, I think, Dante, too. She laughed. Addition. Think of providing for one's old age. And would you refuse to see Venice if you had the chance? Instead of answering her, he wondered whether he should tell her something that was quite true about himself, and as he wondered, he told her. I've planned out my life in sections ever since I was a child, to make it last longer. And so am I. Catherine exclaimed. Addition, but, after all, she added, why should you miss anything? Why? Because I'm poor, for one thing, Ralph rejoined. Addition, you, I suppose, can have Venice and India and Dante every day of your life. She said nothing for a moment, but rested one hand, which was bare of glove, upon the rail in front of her. Meditating upon a variety of things, of which one was that this strange young man pronounced Dante as she was used to hearing it pronounced. And another, that he had, most unexpectedly, a feeling about life that was familiar to her. Perhaps, then, he was the sort of person she might take an interest in, if she came to know him better. And as she had placed him among those whom she would never want to know better, this was enough to make her silent. She hastily recalled her first view of him, in the little room where the relics were kept, and ran a bar through half her impressions. As one cancels a badly written sentence, having found the right one. But to know that one might have things doesn't alter the fact that one hasn't got them, she said, in some confusion. How could I go to India, for example? Besides, she began impulsively, and stopped herself. Here the conductor came round, and interrupted them. Ralph waited for her to resume her sentence, but she said no more. I have a message to give your father, he remarked. Addition, perhaps you would give it him, or I could come. Yes, do come, Catherine replied. Addition, still, I don't see why you shouldn't go to India, Ralph began, in order to keep her from rising, as she threatened to do. But she got up in spite of him, and said goodbye with her usual air of decision, and left him with a quickness which Ralph connected now with all her movements. He looked down and saw her standing on the pavement edge, an alert, commanding figure, which waited its season to cross, and then walked boldly and swiftly to the other side. That gesture and action would be added to the picture he had of her, but at present the real woman completely routed the phantom one. Chapter 7. And little Augustus Pelham said to me, "It's the younger generation knocking at the door," and I said to him, "Oh, but the younger generation comes in without knocking, Mr. Pelham." Such a feeble little joke, wasn't it? But down it went into his notebook all the same. "Let us congratulate ourselves that we shall be in the grave before that work is published," said Mr. Hilbery. The elderly couple were waiting for the dinner bell to ring and for their daughter to come into the room. Their armchairs were drawn up on either side of the fire, and each sat in the same slightly crouched position, looking into the coals, with the expressions of people who have had their share of experiences and wait, rather passively, for something to happen. Mr. Hilbery now gave all his attention to a piece of coal which had fallen out of the grate, and to selecting a favorable position for it among the lumps that were burning already. Mrs. Hilbery watched him in silence, and the smile changed on her lips as if her mind still played with the events of the afternoon. When Mr. Hilbery had accomplished his task, he resumed his crouching position again, and began to toy with the little green stone attached to his watch chain. His deep, oval-shaped eyes were fixed upon the flames, but behind the superficial glaze seemed to brood an observant and whimsical spirit, which kept the brown of the eye still unusually vivid. But a look of indolence, the result of skepticism or of a taste too fastidious to be satisfied by the prizes and conclusions so easily within his grasp, lent him an expression almost of melancholy. After sitting thus for a time, he seemed to reach some point in his thinking which demonstrated its futility, upon which he sighed and stretched his hand for a book lying on the table by his side. Directly the door opened he closed the book, and the eyes of father and mother both rested on Catherine as she came towards them. The sight seemed at once to give them a motive which they had not had before. To them she appeared, as she walked towards them in her light evening dress, extremely young, and the sight of her refreshed them. Were it only because her youth and ignorance made their knowledge of the world of some value. "The only excuse for you, Catherine, is that dinner is still later than you are," said Mr. Hilbery, putting down his spectacles. "I don't mind her being late when the result is so charming," said Mrs. Hilbery, looking with pride at her daughter. "Still, I don't know that I like your being out so late, Catherine," she continued. "You took a cab, I hope?" Here dinner was announced, and Mr. Hilbery formally led his wife downstairs on his room. They were all dressed for dinner, and, indeed, the prettiness of the dinner table merited that compliment. There was no cloth upon the table, and the china made regular circles of deep blue upon the shining brown wood. In the middle there was a bowl of tawny red and yellow chrysanthemums, and one of pure white, so fresh that the narrow petals were curved backwards into a firm white ball. From the surrounding walls the heads of 3 famous Victorian writers surveyed this entertainment, and slips of paper pasted beneath them testified in the great man's own handwriting that he was yours sincerely or affectionately or forever. The father and daughter would have been quite content, apparently, to eat their dinner in silence, or with a few cryptic remarks expressed in a shorthand which could not be understood by the servants. But silence depressed Mrs. Hilbery, and far from minding the presence of maids, she would often address herself to them, and was never altogether unconscious of their approval or disapproval of her remarks. In the first place she called them to witness that the room was darker than usual, and had all the lights turned on. "That's more cheerful," she exclaimed. "D'you know, Catherine, that ridiculous goose came to tea with me? Oh, how I wanted you! He tried to make epigrams all the time, and I got so nervous, expecting them, you know, that I spilt the tea and he made an epigram about that." "Which ridiculous goose?" Catherine asked her father. "Only one of my geese, happily, makes epigrams. Augustus Pelham, of course," said Mrs. Hilbery. "I'm not sorry that I was out," said Catherine. "Poor Augustus." Mrs. Hilbery exclaimed addition, "But we're all too hard on him. Remember how devoted he is to his tiresome old mother." "That's only because she is his mother." "No, no, Catherine, that's too bad," Mr. Hilbery suggested, cynical. "Well, that'll do. I don't believe in sending girls to college, but I should teach them that sort of thing. It makes one feel so dignified, bringing out these little allusions, and passing on gracefully to the next topic. But I don't know what's come over me. I actually had to ask Augustus the name of the lady Hamlet was in love with. As you were out, Catherine, and heaven knows what he mayn't put down about me in his diary." "I wish," Catherine started, with great impetuosity, and checked herself. Her mother always stirred her to feel and think quickly, and then she remembered that her father was there, listening with attention. "What is it you wish?" He often surprised her, thus, into telling him what she had not meant to tell him, and then they argued, while Mrs. Hilbery went on with her own thoughts. "I wish Mother wasn't famous. I was out at tea, and they would talk to me about poetry." "Thinking you must be poetical, I see, and aren't you?" "Who's been talking to you about poetry, Catherine?" Mrs. Hilbery demanded, and Catherine was committed to giving her parents an account of her visit to the suffrage office. They have an office at the top of one of the old houses in Russell Square. I never saw such queer-looking people. And the man discovered I was related to the poet, and talked to me about poetry. Even Mary Datchet seems different in that atmosphere. "Yes, the office atmosphere is very bad for the soul," said Mr. Hilbery. "I don't remember any offices in Russell Square in the old days, when Mama lived there," Mrs. Hilbery mused. "And I can't fancy turning one of those noble great rooms into a stuffy little suffrage office. Still, if the clerks read poetry, there must be something nice about them." "No, because they don't read it as we read it," Catherine insisted addition, "but it's nice to think of them reading your grandfather. And not filling up those dreadful little forms all day long," Mrs. Hilbery persisted, her notion of office life being derived from some chance view of a scene behind the counter at her bank, as she slipped the sovereigns into her purse. "At any rate, they haven't made a convert of Catherine, which was what I was afraid of," Mr. Hilbery remarked addition. "Oh no," said Catherine very decidedly, "I wouldn't work with them for anything." "It's curious," Mr. Hilbery continued, agreeing with his daughter, "how the sight of one's fellow enthusiasts always chokes one off. They show up the faults of one's cause so much more plainly than one's Antigone saints. One can be enthusiastic in one's study, but directly one comes into touch with the people who agree with one, all the glamour goes. So I've always found," and he proceeded to tell them, as he peeled his apple, how he committed himself once, in his youthful days, to make a speech at a political meeting, and went there ablaze with enthusiasm for the ideals of his own side. But while his leaders spoke, he became gradually converted to the other way of thinking, if thinking it could be called, and had to feign illness in order to avoid making a fool of himself, an experience which had sickened him of public meetings. Catherine listened and felt as she generally did when her father, and to some extent her mother, described their feelings. That she quite understood and agreed with them, but, at the same time, saw something which they did not see, and always felt some disappointment when they fell short of her vision, as they always did. The plates succeeded each other swiftly and noiselessly in front of her, and the table was decked for dessert. And as the talk murmured on in familiar grooves, she sat there, rather like a judge, listening to her parents, who did, indeed, feel it very pleasant when they made her laugh. Daily life in a house where there are young and old is full of curious little ceremonies and pieties, which are discharged quite punctually, though the meaning of them is obscure, and a mystery has come to brood over them which lends even a superstitious charm to their performance. Such was the nightly ceremony of the cigar and the glass of port, which were placed on the right hand and on the left hand of Mr. Hilbery. And simultaneously Mrs. Hilbery and Catherine left the room. All the years they had lived together they had never seen Mr. Hilbery smoke his cigar or drink his port, and they would have felt it unseemly if, by chance, they had surprised him as he sat there. These short, but clearly marked, periods of separation between the sexes were always used for an intimate postscript to what had been said at dinner. The sense of being women together coming out most strongly when the male sex was, as if by some religious rite, secluded from the female. Catherine knew by heart the sort of mood that possessed her as she walked upstairs to the drawing-room, her mother's arm in hers, and she could anticipate the pleasure with which, when she had turned on the lights, they both regarded the drawing-room, fresh swept and set in order for the last section of the day, with the red parrots swinging on the chintz curtains, and the armchairs warming in the blaze. "Oh, Catherine," she exclaimed, "how you've made me think of Mamma and the old days in Russell Square. I can see the chandeliers, and the green silk of the piano, and Mamma sitting in her cashmere shawl by the window, singing till the little ragamuffin boys outside stopped to listen. Papa sent me in with a bunch of violets while he waited round the corner. It must have been a summer evening. That was before things were hopeless." As she spoke, an expression of regret, which must have come frequently to cause the lines which now grew deep round the lips and eyes, settled on her face. The poet's marriage had not been a happy one. He had left his wife, and after some years of a rather reckless existence, she had died, before her time. This disaster had led to great irregularities of education, and, indeed, Mrs. Hilbery might be said to have escaped education altogether. But she had been her father's companion at the season when he wrote the finest of his poems. She had sat on his knee in taverns and other haunts of drunken poets. And it was for her sake, so people said, that he had cured himself of his dissipation, and become the irreproachable literary character that the world knows, whose inspiration had deserted him. Catherine wished to comfort her mother, but it was difficult to do this satisfactorily when the facts themselves were so much of a legend. The house in Russell Square, for example, with its noble rooms, and the magnolia tree in the garden, and the sweet-voiced piano, and the sound of feet coming down the corridors, and other properties of size and romance, had they any existence? Yet why should Mrs. Allardyce live all alone in this gigantic mansion, and, if she did not live alone, with whom did she live? For its own sake, Catherine rather liked this tragic story, and would have been glad to hear the details of it, and to have been able to discuss them frankly. But this it became less and less possible to do, for though Mrs. Hilbery was constantly reverting to the story, it was always in this tentative and restless fashion, as though, by a touch here and there, she could set things straight which had been crooked these 60 years. Perhaps, indeed, she no longer knew what the truth was. "If they'd lived now," she concluded, "I feel it wouldn't have happened. Edition people aren't so set upon tragedy as they were then. If my father had been able to go round the world, or if she'd had a rest cure, everything would have come right. But what could I do? And then they had bad friends, both of them, who made mischief. Ah, Catherine, when you marry, be quite sure that you love your husband." The tears stood in Mrs. Hilbery's eyes. While comforting her, Catherine thought to herself, "Now this is what Mary Datchet and Mr. Denham don't understand. This is the sort of position I'm always getting into. How simple it must be to live as they do." For all the evening she had been comparing her home and her father and mother with the suffrage office and the people there. "But, Catherine," Mrs. Hilbery continued, with one of her sudden changes of mood, "though, heaven knows, I don't want to see you married, surely if ever a man loved a woman, William loves you. And it's a nice, rich-sounding name too, Catherine Rodney, which, unfortunately, doesn't mean that he's got any money, because he hasn't. The alteration of her name annoyed Catherine, and she observed, rather sharply, that she didn't want to marry anyone. It's very dull that you can only marry one husband, certainly, Mrs. Hilbery reflected. I always wish that you could marry everybody who wants to marry you. Perhaps they'll come to that in time, but meanwhile I confess that dear William Dash. But here Mr. Hilbery came in, and the more solid part of the evening began. This consisted in the reading aloud by Catherine from some prose work or other, while her mother knitted scarves intermittently on a little circular frame. And her father read the newspaper, not so attentively but that he could comment humorously now and again upon the fortunes of the hero and the heroine. The Hilberys subscribed to a library, which delivered books on Tuesdays and Fridays, and Catherine did her best to interest her parents in the works of living and highly respectable authors. But Mrs. Hilbery was perturbed by the very look of the light, gold-wreathed volumes, and would make little faces as if she tasted something bitter as the reading went on. While Mr. Hilbery would treat the moderns with a curious elaborate banter such as one might apply to the antics of a promising child. So this evening, after 5 pages or so of one of these masters, Mrs. Hilbery protested that it was all too clever and cheap and nasty for words. Please, Catherine, read us something real. Catherine had to go to the bookcase and choose a portly volume in sleek, yellow calf, which had directly a sedative effect upon both her parents. But the delivery of the evening post broke in upon the periods of Henry Fielding, and Catherine found that her letters needed all her attention. Chapter 8. She took her letters up to her room with her, having persuaded her mother to go to bed directly Mr. Hilbery left them. For so long as she sat in the same room as her mother, Mrs. Hilbery might, at any moment, ask for a sight of the passant. A very hasty glance through many sheets had shown Catherine that, by some coincidence, her attention had to be directed to many different anxieties simultaneously. In the first place, Rodney had written a very full account of his state of mind, which was illustrated by a sonnet. And he demanded a reconsideration of their position, which agitated Catherine more than she liked. Then there were 2 letters which had to be laid side by side and compared before she could make out the truth of their story. And even when she knew the facts she could not decide what to make of them, and finally she had to reflect upon a great many pages from a cousin who found himself in financial difficulties, which forced him to the uncongenial occupation of teaching the young ladies of Bungay to play upon the violin. But the 2 letters which each told the same story differently were the chief source of her perplexity. She was really rather shocked to find it definitely established that her own second cousin, Cyril Allardyce, had lived for the last 4 years with a woman who was not his wife, who had borne him 2 children, and was now about to bear him another. This state of things had been discovered by Mrs. Milvain, her Aunt Celia, a zealous inquirer into such matters, whose letter was also under consideration. Cyril, she said, must be made to marry the woman at once, and Cyril, rightly or wrongly, was indignant with such interference with his affairs, and would not own that he had any cause to be ashamed of himself. Had he any cause to be ashamed of himself, Catherine wondered, and she turned to her aunt again. Remember, she wrote, in her profuse, emphatic statement, that he bears your grandfather's name, and so will the child that is to be born. The poor boy is not so much to blame as the woman who deluded him, thinking him a gentleman, which he is, and having money, which he has not. What would Ralph Denham say to this? Thought Catherine, beginning to pace up and down her bedroom. She twitched aside the curtains so that, on turning, she was faced by darkness, and looking out, could just distinguish the branches of a plane tree and the yellow lights of someone else's windows. What would Mary Datchet and Ralph Denham say? She reflected, pausing. by the window, which, as the night was warm, she raised, in order to feel the air upon her face, and to lose herself in the nothingness of night. But with the air the distant humming sound of far-off crowded thoroughfares was admitted to the room. The incessant and tumultuous hum of the distant traffic seemed, as she stood there, to represent the thick texture of her life. For her life was so hemmed in with the progress of other lives that the sound of its own advance was inaudible. People like Ralph and Mary, she thought, had it all their own way, and an empty space before them, and, as she envied them, she cast her mind out to imagine an empty land where all this petty intercourse of men and women, this life made up of the dense crossings and entanglements of men and women, had no existence whatever. Even now, alone, at night, looking out into the shapeless mass of London, she was forced to remember that there was one point and here another with which she had some connection. William Rodney, at this very moment, was seated in a minute speck of light somewhere to the east of her, and his mind was occupied, not with his book, but with her. She wished that no one in the whole world would think of her. However, there was no way of escaping from one's fellow beings, she concluded, and shut the window with a sigh, and returned once more to her letters. She could not doubt but that William's letter was the most genuine she had yet received from him. He had come to the conclusion that he could not live without her, he wrote. He believed that he knew her, and could give her happiness, and that their marriage would be unlike other marriages. Nor was the sonnet, in spite of its accomplishment, lacking in passion, and Catherine, as she read the pages through again, could see in what direction her feelings ought to flow, supposing they revealed themselves. She would come to feel a humorous sort of tenderness for him, a zealous care for his susceptibilities, and, after all, she considered, thinking of her father and mother, what is love? Naturally, with her face, position, and background, she had experience of young men who wished to marry her, and made protestations of love, but, perhaps because she did not return the feeling, it remained something of a pageant to her. Not having experience of it herself, her mind had unconsciously occupied itself for some years in dressing up an image of love, and the marriage that was the outcome of love, and the man who inspired love, which naturally dwarfed any examples that came her way. Easily, and without correction by reason, her imagination made pictures, superb backgrounds casting a rich though phantom light upon the facts in the foreground. Splendid as the waters that drop with resounding thunder from high ledges of rock, and plunge downwards into the blue depths of night, was the presence of love she dreamt, drawing into it every drop of the force of life, and dashing them all asunder in the superb catastrophe in which everything was surrendered. And nothing might be reclaim edition. The man, too, was some magnanimous hero, riding a great horse by the shore of the sea. They rode through forests together, they galloped by the rim of the sea. But waking, she was able to contemplate a perfectly loveless marriage, as the thing one did actually in real life, for possibly the people who dream thus are those who do the most prosaic things. At this moment she was much inclined to sit on into the night, spinning her light fabric of thoughts until she tired of their futility, and went to her mathematics, but, as she knew very well, it was necessary that she should see her father before he went to B-edition. The case of Cyril Allardyce must be discussed, her mother's illusions and the rights of the family attended to. Being vague herself as to what all this amounted to, she had to take counsel with her father. She took her letters in her hand and went downstairs. It was past 11, and the clocks had come into their reign, the grandfather's clock in the hall ticking in competition with the small clock on the landing. Mr. Hilbery's study ran out behind the rest of the house, on the ground floor, and was a very silent, subterranean place, the sun in daytime casting a mere abstract of light through a skylight upon his books and the large table, with its spread of white papers, now illumined by a green reading lamp. Here Mr. Hilbery sat editing his review, or placing together documents by means of which it could be proved that Shelley had written of, instead of, and, or that the inn in which Byron had slept was called the Nag's Head, and not the Turkish Knight, or that the Christian name of Keats's uncle had been John rather than Richard, for he knew more minute details about these poets than any man in England. Probably, and was preparing an edition of Shelley which scrupulously observed the poet's system of punctuation. He saw the humor of these researches, but that did not prevent him from carrying them out with the utmost scrupulosity. He was lying back comfortably in a deep armchair smoking a cigar, and ruminating the fruitful question as to whether Coleridge had wished to marry Dorothy Wordsworth. And what, if he had done so, would have been the consequences to him in particular, and to literature in general. When Catherine came in he reflected that he knew what she had come for, and he made a pencil note before he spoke to her. Having done this, he saw that she was reading, and he watched her for a moment without saying anything. She was reading Isabella and the Pot of Basil, and her mind was full of the Italian hills and the blue daylight, and the hedges set with little rosettes of red and white roses. Feeling that her father waited for her, she sighed and said, shutting her book, "I've had a letter from Aunt Celia about Cyril, father. It seems to be true about his marriage. What are we to do?" "Cyril seems to have been behaving in a very foolish manner," said Mr. Hilbery, in his pleasant and deliberate tones. Catherine found some difficulty in carrying on the conversation, while her father balanced his fingertips so judiciously, and seemed to reserve so many of his thoughts for himself. "He's about done for himself, I should say," he continued addition without saying anything. He took Catherine's letters out of her hand, adjusted his eyeglasses, and read them through. At length he said, "Humph," and gave the letters back to her. "Mother knows nothing about it," Catherine remarked. Addition, "Will you tell her?" "I shall tell your mother. But I shall tell her that there is nothing whatever for us to do." "But the marriage?" Catherine asked, with some diffidence. Mr. Hilbery said nothing, and stared into the fire. What in the name of conscience did he do it for? He speculated at last, rather to himself than to her. Catherine had begun to read her aunt's letter over again, and she now quoted a sentence. "Ibsen and Butler. He has sent me a letter full of quotations, nonsense, though clever nonsense. Well, if the younger generation want to carry on its life on those lines, it's none of our affair," he remarked. Addition, "But isn't it our affair, perhaps, to make them get married?" Catherine asked rather wearily. "Why the dickens should they apply to me?" her father demanded with sudden irritation. "Only as the head of the family dash." "But I'm not the head of the family. Alfred's the head of the family." "Let them apply to Alfred," said Mr. Hilbery, relapsing again into his armchair. Catherine was aware that she had touched a sensitive spot, however, in mentioning the family. "I think, perhaps, the best thing would be for me to go and see them," she observed. Addition. "I won't have you going anywhere near them," Mr. Hilbery replied with unwonted decision and authority. "Indeed, I don't understand why they've dragged you into the business at all. I don't see that it's got anything to do with you." "I've always been friends with Cyril," Catherine observed. Addition. "But did he ever tell you anything about this?" Mr. Hilbery asked rather sharply. Catherine shook her head. She was, indeed, a good deal hurt that Cyril had not confided in her. Did he think, as Ralph Denham or Mary Datchet might think, that she was, for some reason, unsympathetic, hostile even? "As to your mother," said Mr. Hilbery, after a pause, in which he seemed to be considering the color of the flames, "you had better tell her the facts. She'd better know the facts before everyone begins to talk about it, though why Aunt Celia thinks it necessary to come, I'm sure I don't know. And the less talk there is the better." granting the assumption that gentlemen of 60 who are highly cultivated and have had much experience of life probably think of many things which they do not say. Catherine could not help feeling rather puzzled by her father's attitude as she went back to her room. What a distance he was from it all. How superficially he smoothed these events into a semblance of decency which harmonized with his own view of life. He never wondered what Cyril had felt, nor did the hidden aspects of the case tempt him to examine into them. He merely seemed to realize, rather languidly, that Cyril had behaved in a way which was foolish, because other people did not behave in that way. He seemed to be looking through a telescope at little figures hundreds of miles in the distance. Her selfish anxiety not to have to tell Mrs. Hilbery what had happened made her follow her father into the hall after breakfast the next morning in order to question him. "Have you told Mother?" she asked. Her manner to her father was almost stern, and she seemed to hold endless depths of reflection in the dark of her eyes. Mr. Hilbery sighed. "My dear child, it went out of my head." He smoothed his silk hat energetically, and at once affected an air of hurry. "I'll send a note round from the office. I'm late this morning, and I've any amount of proofs to get through." "That wouldn't do at all," Catherine said decidedly. "She must be told you, or I must tell her." Mr. Hilbery had now placed his hat on his head, and his hand was on the doorknob. An expression which Catherine knew well from her childhood, when he asked her to shield him in some neglect of duty, came into his eyes. Malice, humor, and irresponsibility were blended in it. He nodded his head to and fro significantly, opened the door with an adroit movement, and stepped out with a lightness unexpected at his age. He waved his hand once to his daughter, and was gone. Left alone, Catherine could not help laughing to find herself cheated as usual in domestic bargainings with her father, and left to do the disagreeable work which belonged, by rights, to him.